Happy Sabbath again. We have been discussing the fulfillment of prophecy in 2019. We've been discussing the fulfillment of prophecy in 2019 to a number of ends, for a number of purposes. I think the primary one is the idea that as a movement we made a range of predictions really in 2018 about the things that were going to take place in 2019. And 2019 has come and gone. And for a movement that has Bible prophecy as its foundation, the critical question comes, the critical test is, can we see the fulfillment of that which was foretold as coming to pass, right? The integrity of this message and the integrity of this movement hinges on that question. And we, over the last week, were reviewing the prophetic span study, which we did not finish, but we laid down enough lines to be able to see, I think, with clarity that the things that were predicted as coming to pass, the restraint of ISIS, the impeachment of Donald Trump, the establishment of Trump as a dictator, to all intents and purposes, as a dictator in the United States, the turn in persecution, the rise of persecution against immigrants, and so on. All these things are the rise of this movement, as this movement begins to protest, as this movement begins to find its political voice. All these things have been fulfilled. Today I want to take a different direction. We were blessed, I think, by doing this study, the prophetic span study, in a group study format. But I'd like to turn our attention to the battles of Raphia and Panium, right? Over the last few years, at least since 2016, we've been looking at the battles of Raphia and Panium laid out in the line of in Daniel 11 verses 5 to 16, as identifying that before we reach the Sunday law waymark, there is a conflict between the king of the north, represented by the United States, and the king of the south, represented by Russia. There is this conflict, this back and forth over a number of battles between these two entities, which leads into the Sunday law waymark, which leads us to the Sunday law waymark. The Battle of Raphia corresponds with 2019, and the Battle of Panium corresponds with 2021. So the prophetic spans, speaking of 2019, we see the things that this study brought out, the information that this study put in place about what was going to take place last year. We also have the Battle of Raphia as another line which feeds information into what we understand was to take place last year. So we're going to look at the battles of Raphia and Panium. The Battle of Raphia specifically, because that's the one that corresponds with 2019. Okay, so for a bit of context, when you look at the battles of Raphia and Panium, verses 5 to 16, what history is that? That is the history of the Greek Empire. It's specifically the history of the divisions of Alexander's kingdom, right? Which were constantly at war with one another, right? So when we look at that history, the battles of Raphia and Panium, they are part of a broader history that constitutes a series of wars, a number of wars called the Syrian Wars. So we're going to look at these Syrian Wars. How many were they? There were 6 Syrian Wars. Right, there were 6 Syrian Wars. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And where do these Syrian wars begin? What marks the beginning of these Syrian wars? History tells us it's the Battle of Ipsus. The Battle of Ipsus marks the commencement of the Syrian wars. Now, I have a Wikipedia entry on the Syrian wars that I'll read briefly, quickly for your hearing. It says, the Syrian wars were a series of 6 wars between the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, successor states to Alexander the Great's empire during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, over the region called Coelo-Syria, one of the few avenues into Egypt. These conflicts drained the material and manpower of both parties and led to their eventual destruction and conquest by Rome and Parthia. They are briefly mentioned in the biblical books of Maccabees. Right? So we have 6 Syrian wars. The next entry I'm going to read is on Coelo-Syria. Right? These Syrian wars, there were a conflict between which empire? The king of the south and the king of the north. The king of the south represented by Ptolemaic Egypt. And the king of the north represented by Syria. The Seleucids. And it was a war that is expressly stated, it was a war that they were fighting over a third region, right? And what region was that? They were fighting for Coelo-Syria. So I'll read this entry on Coelo-Syria, also from Wikipedia. It says, in 302 BC, Ptolemy joined a new coalition against Antigonus and reoccupied Coelo-Syria. I guess what's the background for this development, right? Prior to the Syrian wars, what did we have? Leading up to the Syrian wars, what did we have? The wars of the Diadochi. These were the successors of Alexander the Great. The Battle of Ipsus marks the end of these of the wars of the Diadochi and the beginning of the Syrian wars. In the Syrian wars, we have the empire divided between 2 parties, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. In the wars of the Diadochi, we see a whole range of parties that were vying for different portions of the kingdom, right? And the arrangement that we often read of in Bible prophecy, where we have Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus. This is part of this history. And at the Battle of Ipsus, we see these 4 parties in conflict with another party, Antigonus. Antigonus being the strongest of all the successors of Alexander, it was his defeat at the Battle of Ipsus that marks the beginning of the Syrian wars. So I'll read this. It says, in 302 BC, Ptolemy joined a new coalition against Antigonus and reoccupied Coelo, Syria, but withdrew on hearing a false report that Antigonus had won a victory. So Antigonus is fighting for control of the territory held by all these other generals. And none of these generals can fight him individually, so they form an alliance in order to try to defeat him, right? And in this alliance, Ptolemy had special interest in this region of Coelo, Syria. Why? Because if you look at the Mediterranean, this is the Mediterranean Sea. Egypt is over here. You can say Judea is over here. And over here you have Mesopotamia or Babylon, which is now Coelo, Syria lay over here. And it served as an important gateway into Egypt. So Ptolemy had special interest in controlling this region. It was an important geopolitical territory. So it says, so as these generals come together and they've formed an alliance and they're preparing to fight Antigonus, Ptolemy receives a false report that these other generals have already been defeated in the battle, right? So it says, Ptolemy, he took control of Coelo, Syria, but quickly withdrew on hearing a false report that Antigonus had won a victory. He was only to return when Antigonus had been defeated at Ipsus in 301 BC. Coelo, Syria was assigned to Seleucus by the victors of Ipsus, as Ptolemy had added nothing to the victory. Though given Ptolemy's track record, he was unlikely to organize a serious defense of Coelo, Syria. Seleucus acquiesced to Ptolemy's occupation, probably because Seleucus remembered how it had been with Ptolemy's help that he had re-established himself in Babylonia. The later Seleucids were not to be so understanding, resulting in the century of Syrian wars between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Battle of Panium in 200 BC during the Fifth Syrian War was the final decisive battle between the two sides in ending Ptolemaic control over the region. So what is all of that saying? So these parties, the four generals and Antigonus, they meet at the Battle of Ipsus. Ptolemy hears a rumor that these generals who got there before him, that they had lost. So he didn't come, he remained in Egypt. The Battle of Ipsus was fought, Antigonus was defeated. So these four generals proceed to carve up the Antigonus's territory between themselves. Ptolemy wanted Coelo, Syria, but it was given to Seleucus because Ptolemy didn't add anything to the battle. But Ptolemy took it anyway. He took control of it anyway. Seleucus did not fight him for it because he remembered the help Ptolemy had offered him, the help Ptolemy had provided for him when he had fled Babylon as a refugee when Antigonus was trying to kill him. So Seleucus did not fight Ptolemy for this territory. But what happens? Seleucus dies. And his sons, his successors, were less understanding. So they're the ones who initiate the competition. They start the fight with the Ptolemaic Egypt for this territory. So thus begins these 6 Syrian wars, which were over this strategically important region of Coelho, Syria. Now, what's all this context for? It's because when we look at the battles of Raphia and Panium, they are part of this history of the Syrian wars. In fact, the Battle of Raphia is part of the history of the Fourth Syrian War, taking place in 217 BC. And the Battle of Panium, as you may have picked up when we read, is part of the history of the Fifth Syrian War, taking place in 200 BC. All this is context for the antitypical battles of Raphia and Panium in our time. Why did we lay all of this out? The point of emphasis I want us to understand is that the character of this conflict, it is not necessarily the king of the south fighting to take Syria, right? And it's not the king of the north fighting to take the land of Egypt. That's not what it is. So put that X there, right? They're fighting for control of a third territory, of a sphere of influence, right? Of a strategic region that is outside the proper realm of their two kingdoms. Does that make sense? So when we come to the antitype, the antitypical battles of Raphia and Panium, of course we have King of the South and King of the North. The King of the South is who? It's Russia. The King of the North, this application is the United States. Where do we locate the battles of Raphia and Panium in our line? Raphia is 2019. Panium is 2021. But we see, based on the model, that these two territories, that Russia and the United States, they're not fighting each other for each other's territory proper. Yes? If we allow the model to instruct us, their type to instruct us, they're not fighting each other for each other's territory. What are they fighting for? They're fighting for spheres of influence. Now, of course, when we look at what this looks like in our history, we can look to other lines to flesh out the picture of what this conflict looks like, right? We know it's not a literal war. It's a war involving. It's not a hot war, if I use that expression. It's a war fought through the use of information. It's information warfare, yes? We can look to other lines to also demonstrate to us that it's characterized by proxy warfare, where these two entities are fighting in the territory of a third party, right? Proxy warfare. Then there's this characteristic of spheres of influence. when we look at the model presented to us here by the the history of the Syrian wars, it's bringing out this aspect of spheres of influence, right? So as we look to the history that has come to pass in our time, can we identify the spheres of influence that these two parties have been in competition for? And can we identify who has been winning this conflict over spheres of influence? And specifically with regards to 2019. In 2019, rather in the Battle of Raphia, who won this battle, the Battle of Raphia? The King of the South wins. And at Panium, the King of the North wins. So can we identify spheres of influence that Russia and the United States are in competition with each other for in 2019, in our history? And furthermore, can we identify Russia winning this conflict over these spheres of influence? Granted that this conflict is not a literal engagement between the two parties. It's characterized by information warfare, diplomatic, political conflict, I can say, political competition, competition of influence over political control of the regions in question. I'd say if we look to the history of the past year, really going back over the past few years, we can see this and we can list these spheres of influence. We'll begin with Syria. We'll identify Turkey. There's Ukraine, Libya, Venezuela, and we can also talk about Africa. The two superpowers, Russia and the United States, have been in conflict with one another for strategic areas, strategic spheres of influence. And as we see the fulfillment of this development, we see these regions and others, but these regions coming into focus, right? As we look at the conflict in Syria, a dynamic that we must also identify is, while we see a fulfillment of the King of the South winning this competition over spheres of influence in 2019, we see the fulfillment in 2019 bookended by developments that we can see in 2014. Our dispensation, or rather the dispensation that has recently come to pass, goes from 2014 to 2019. And while we can identify the King of the South winning in this competition over these various spheres of influence, we see the developments we see in 2019, we really trace their beginning to 2014. Okay, let me do this. So as we consider the conflict in Syria, what took place in Syria with the conflict in Syria in 2019? Russia and the United States have been competing for influence over this country for the reason that Syria is an important, it's located in a strategically important region, right? In terms of energy pipelines, Russia is located in a strategically important area for energy pipelines. So both the United States and Russia are seeking to exert a great level of control over this country. So I have an article here from NBC News, and it's regarding a development we can see in 2019, which is America's withdrawal from Syria. Right. And this article makes a few significant points. Maybe I'll give you the title. It's called it's from NBC News. I'll erase this. NBC News. And the article is entitled, US withdraws. As the US withdraws, Assad and Putin are emerging as the winners in Syria. As the US withdraws, Assad and Putin are emerging as the winners in Syria. Okay, so just read a portion of this. It says, in less than a week, the tectonic plates have shifted beyond recognition in the Middle East. The US counterterrorism operation against the Islamic State militant group, or ISIS, in northern Syria is in shreds. The US military is accelerating its plans toward an almost total withdrawal from Syria, and the Kurdish troops in the northeast have called on Damascus and Moscow to help repel the invading Turkish forces. The map of territorial control in Syria has begun shifting. Kurdish fighters who once stood side by side with the United States are now being absorbed into the Syrian army's 5th Corps under Russian command. And Russia will quite literally move into the space vacated by President Donald Trump. And Trump does not appear to mind. Quote, others may want to come in and fight for one side or the other, he posted on Twitter on Sunday. Let them. Analysts said it was clear that Syrian President Bashar Assad and Russian President Vladimir Putin were emerging as the winners of the geopolitical puzzle, and the Kurds and the US as the losers. It also looks like ISIS will benefit too, and may be able to resurge as stability eludes the region. Right, so we have here a conflict in Syria. Where does it begin? It begins in 2011, where we have the Arab Spring. The protests eventually degenerate into the civil war, and America enters the civil war in 2014, right? So now America's entered the civil war. Syria is important to Russia for strategic purposes because Russia has a base, right? Has an important base in Syria. So Russia involves itself in this conflict as well. And we come to 2019, and we have the United States essentially ceding the ground, giving up the conflict by withdrawing. And the very bases that the United States left in Syria, Russia literally moved in to those very bases that had been left behind by the United States, right? I was reading an article that talks about how the Russians moved in and they found the pantry still full of food, right? Because the Americans had left so quickly, right? So, sphere of influence. We have America withdrawing from Syria and leaving it in to the control of Russia. Russia and Turkey being the winners in this development, right? So we see that in 2019. The conflict, as far as America's involvement, begins in 2014. 2019, we see Russia winning in this strategic region. The article we read also mentions Turkey. What took place with Turkey in 2019? Firstly, what is Turkey? What is its significance? Turkey is a buffer country between Europe and Russia. Right? You have Turkey, Russia to the east, Europe to the west. So Turkey is like a buffer country between Europe and Russia. In fact, Turkey often serves as the middleman in discussions, dispute resolution, and so on between Russia and Europe. So Turkey is strategically important in that sense. Turkey, a buffer country between Europe and Russia. Europe and the West have been trying to draw Turkey under its own influence. Turkey is a member of NATO. But in 2019, we see developments where Turkey begins to come increasingly under the influence of Russia. We have a dictator coming into power in Turkey in 2014. Erdogan, the current president, he served as prime minister, I think, 2003 to 2013. He was prime minister of Turkey. He then proceeds to creates a position, given that his constitutional term had expired, he creates a position of president, which apparently it's supposedly a ceremonial position. But he creates a position for himself that allows him to continue. And you can trace the descent into authoritarianism that Turkey has gone into under Erdogan. 2014, you have the dictator being put in place. And in 2019, he is the one who is drawing his country further from the influence of the United States and NATO and bring it into the orbit of Russia. This is brought to you in an article. I'll share this. It's from the Wall Street Journal. WSJ. This is the Wall Street Journal, an online newspaper. And the article is called NATO Forces Face a Fresh Quandary. A quandary is like a problem or difficulty as Turkey tips towards Russia. NATO forces face a fresh quandary as Turkey tips towards Russia. So it says, Turkey's president has warned that he would evict US forces from 2 military bases in his country if Washington imposes new sanctions on his government, creating a quandary for the NATO alliance as it seeks to cope with Ankara's deepening ties to Russia. In a television interview this month, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said if the US punishes Turkey for its purchase of a Russian air defense system, then if necessary, we may close these 2 bases installations where the US keeps nuclear weapons and operates critical radar. It goes on to say, Turkey, which has NATO's biggest standing army after the US, has taken steps that have put it at odds with Washington and the rest of the alliance, including sending its army into northern Syria to fight a US allied militia and purchasing the Russian S-400 missile system. It feels like watching a car crash in slow motion, a Western diplomat in Turkey said. The Trump administration has sought to cajole Mr. Erdogan in a bid to prevent Ankara from knitting closer ties with Moscow amid concerns that treating him like a pariah would push Turkey further into Russia's orbit, US officials said. So as you look at the development of this relationship with Turkey, an important buffer region, an important middleman, right, between Russia and the United States. Extensive work is done by the West to draw Turkey into its sphere of influence. Turkey is a member of NATO, an important member of NATO because it has the largest standing army after the United States. But now we see these diplomatic rifts forming where Turkey is increasingly coming under the sphere, under the influence of Russia, right? And it cites the causes of the conflict. Turkey begins purchasing Russian military equipment. The United States doesn't like this and begins to punish Turkey, right, by canceling various contracts that it had with Turkey to supply them with military weapons. And Turkey responds by saying, if you're going to do that, we're going to buy more from Russia, right? The United States canceled the contracts for a contract that it had with Turkey to supply them with a state-of-the-art jet fighter, the F-35, right? And then Turkey says, fine, if you're going to cancel our contract, then we'll buy jets from Russia instead, right? So you see this development. Turkey is increasingly coming under the sphere of influence of Russia. And I was reading some articles this morning which are pointing to the increasing cooperation between Erdogan and Putin over the conflict in Syria and other issues. So do we see America losing in this, over this strategic region, this sphere of influence, as far as Turkey is concerned? I think, yes, we see it. Right. There's another article still dealing with Turkey, and I'll give it to you. It's from the Business Insider. The Business Insider, it's a news outlet. The Business Insider, this is, the article is called Vladimir Putin is looking unstoppable. After a string of victories. That Trump handed to him on a plate. Now it says, Vladimir Putin is on a roll. This week alone, the Russian president replaced the US as the chief power broker in Syria, drew a NATO member and buffer between Russia and Europe close to its orbit, showed global ambition by hosting all 54 African nations to sign billions in new business deals, right? All this happened in a short space of time. Russia replaces the US as the chief power broker in Syria when America withdrew. And then the second point is dealing with its drawing Turkey into its orbit. And I'm going to read the portion of the article that speaks to this. It says, Putin's deal to jointly patrol northeastern Syria with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, made on Tuesday, establishes Russia as a power player in the war-torn country. Putin is now a bridge between Turkish militants and Bashar al-Assad's regime, a guarantor of regional security. His renewed friendship with Erdogan has also secured for him an ally and a useful buffer between the Russian heartland and European territory. As the only country straddling Asia and Europe, Turkey has long served as Russia and Europe's middleman. Putin's embrace of Turkey comes despite its membership of NATO, the military bloc formed specifically to check Russian ambition. NATO was formed to keep Russia's former Soviet empire in check. Now Russian military police have unrestrained access to hundreds of kilometers of NATO's southern border at the invitation of a NATO member. Right, so it's just making this point that as we see Turkey opening up to Russia, right, as a NATO member, which was formed to control Russia, to check Russia's ambitions, that a NATO member, such a powerful NATO member, should come into an alliance-like relationship with Russia is certainly a loss geopolitically for the King of the North, the United States. Okay, we'll look at Venezuela. So Venezuela has been in turmoil for a long time. Really, shortly after the death of Hugo Chavez and Maduro came in, things started to deteriorate very quickly. And you come to 2014 in Venezuela, you see now protests erupting over, I guess, the condition of things in the country, over the poor governance situation. And these protests were led by a sort of firebrand political leader called Leopoldo Lopez. Now, Leopoldo Lopez, so you have these protests. These protests are here in 2014. 2014, these protests break out. Leopoldo Lopez is arrested and he's put under house arrest. I believe he's under house arrest to this day. But he had a man that he mentored. This man that he mentored is goes by the name Juan Guaido. Juan Guaido, right? Juan Guaido is then made the leader of Leopoldo Lopez's political party in 2019. And in 2019, this crisis erupts where Guaido, he announces himself as the president, right? And it escalates this sort of conflict, between the government and these opposition elements that were protesting the condition of things in the country. So these protests are happening. Guaido announces himself as president. The United States, what does the United States do? The United States and much of the West, they immediately throw their influence behind Guaido, right? That they want to see Maduro overthrown and they want to see Guaido replace Maduro. What does Russia do? Russia, which has a long diplomatic relationship with Venezuela, it comes behind Maduro, right? So for a long time, there was a period of time in 2019 when it really looked like Maduro is going to be overthrown. It really looked like the groundswell of opposition internally and the international support from the most powerful nations in the world, including the United States, was going to lead to his eventually being overthrown. But it was really due to Russian influence. Russia sent 100 troops. It was the 100 or 200. Russia sent 100 troops to Venezuela for the specific purpose of protecting Maduro from anything that would look like a coup, right? And Russia has used its influence, right, to keep Maduro in office, has done all it can to keep Maduro in office. So in this conflict where America's goal was to have Maduro overthrown and Russia's goal was to keep Maduro in power, 2019 has come and gone. What has taken place? Who has won in that conflict? The King of the South, right? The King of the South. And actually Trump lost interest. I think the statement he says, it's too hard, it's too complicated, right? Because he wasn't quickly able to meet his goals, the United States has also somewhat lost interest in the situation there. And certainly we see, as far as Venezuela is concerned, we see the King of the South winning over that sphere of influence. Now, Africa. Africa becomes important to Russia because in 2014, Russia invades Ukraine, right? It annexes the Crimea, just takes a portion of that country and says it's ours now, basically. It invades Crimea, and how did the Western world respond? They hit it with sanctions. Russia was hit with sanctions, very painful sanctions, which affected its trade, affected its economy. So Russia is now looking for trade agreements and trade partners to bypass these sanctions, right? To bypass these sanctions. And where is it looking to? It's looking to Africa, right? If it can develop trade with Africa, right, as an alternative to those opportunities and those trade agreements that it has lost through these sanctions, Russia has been looking to accomplish that. And what do we see in 2019? There's this article, again, this is also from the Business Insider. It's this same article, actually, the same article that I quoted earlier. The section dealing with Putin's expansion into Africa. It says, highlighted in this week's first Russia-Africa summit, this week's first Russia-Africa summit has shown to the world a desire to cement Russia's economic influence beyond its immediate surroundings. The Soviet Union used to have a major presence on the continent, but that has decreased since the end of the Cold War. Whether it's through diamond extraction or arms sales in Madagascar or energy sales in Nigeria or Libya, the Russians are showing themselves to be an increasing force to be reckoned with, said James Nixie, head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. So you can read the rest of this article, but the point is the first Russia-Africa summit was held in 2019 in Sochi. It hosted all 54 African nations, and it says billions in new business deals were signed then. So now Russia is projecting itself as a power of trade, as a trade power, essentially. And when you look at African leaders, what is it that African leaders like about Russia? What is that African leaders like about Russia? Dictatorships, right? Russia's a dictatorship. Most African countries are dictatorships, right? So when you come to the table, when you go to the table with a Western country and you say, you know what, we need aid, or can we do some trade? What do the Western countries start bringing up? Persecution, rule of law, what's happening in your country with human rights. And a lot of the trade deals and a lot of aid is attached to conditions, has conditions which say, we won't give you this until this situation improves, right? We'll only give you this if your human rights situation improves, right? We're saying, we'll give you this package, but we want to see this happen in the area of women's rights, LGBTQ rights, right? The aid it has strings attached. And do African dictators like that? No, they don't. When you come to the table with Russia, are there any questions about that? No, it's just, let's do business, right? What happens in your yard, what you do there, that's your business. It doesn't even come up in the conversation. It's just a strictly business deal. That's why African leaders like Russia. That's why they like China too, right? Okay, so there are other spheres of influence that we can identify. But I think from the ones we've looked at, we see quite clearly that as the Battle of Raphia was a battle over a sphere of influence, a strategic region, Coeli, Syria, right? And that the king of the south, Egypt, won this battle. As we apply this model to our time, to our recent history, we see the same thing. As we look at the spheres of influence that exist between Russia and the United States, Russia has gained marked victories over the United States in 2019, really across the board, right? So when we want to understand what does the Battle of Raphia look like, we've established that. Was it fulfilled according to the type? We can say yes, right? So it's important that as we've been looking over the last week to identify the fulfillment of prophecy in 2019, we've seen point by point that prophecy has been fulfilled. On this point, we see that it has been fulfilled also. Why is this important to understand? It's important not only to demonstrate the integrity of our message, but it's important also to highlight this point of what the fulfillment of prophecy looks like, right? What does the fulfillment of prophecy look like in our time? It's not Russian missiles on American soil and American missiles blowing up Russian buildings. It's not direct engagement. It's not nuclear bombs going off between these two countries. It's characterized by political conflict over spheres of influence, information warfare, proxy warfare. And that's what we see in 2019. I want to take a step, I want to consider a dynamic that is brought to view by another line. This is the Syrian wars. When we look at another history, if we look at another, which presents us with a line, which is the history of Pyrrhus. When we look at the Pyrrhic Wars, the Battle of Raphia corresponds with what battle? The Battle of Asculum. And when we look at the Battle of Asculum, as with all those battles in the Pyrrhic Wars, Pyrrhus won. But there was there's a specific characteristic of his victories that is brought out. What is it? They're Pyrrhic victories. Right? What's a Pyrrhic victory? It's a victory where you win the fight, but you're not stronger for it. Right? It's a battle where you win the fight, but the effort in winning that fight leaves you weaker than you were. Right? That's a Pyrrhic victory. And there's already evidence emerging that these victories that Russia has been gaining, as spectacular as they look, when you scratch below the surface and really investigate the fundamentals, they're not making Russia stronger, right? They're Pyrrhic victories. And there's more and more sort of news analysis that is being brought out that is making this point. So I just want to quote one or two articles that are making this point, that these victories that Russia is winning, they look spectacular, and they are significant, but they're fundamentally Pyrrhic victories. Now, this is from the Washington Post. And it's an article. It says, Putin touts Russia as a great power. Putin touts Russia as a great power, but he has made it a weak one. The whole article is worth reading. I'll just read portions of it. It says, from Venezuela to Syria to Ukraine, Moscow is playing an assertive role in global affairs. Observers often give Vladimir Putin the credit for bringing Russia back as a force to be reckoned with on the international stage, despite the country's acknowledged weakness. Former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright expressed a common view in a recent interview. Putin, she said, is playing a weak hand very well internationally. Yet that analysis betrays a fundamental flaw. Power in global politics is not dealt from a deck of cards, but is a function of state policy. Putin has now been leading his country for almost 20 years. If anyone has made Russia's hand weak, it's him. Their failure to create a more dynamic economy is the root of the problem. Thanks to high energy prices and fiscal caution, the Kremlin has accrued large reserve funds, but the economy has stagnated for a decade. When he returned to the presidency in 2012, Putin promised 6% growth per year, but the Russian economy is now about the same size as it was in 2008. And average real income for ordinary Russians has declined for 6 years running. Putin's foreign policy, too, has led to reactions that have ultimately limited Russia's power. My research shows that the annexation of Crimea brought a 4-year surge in support for Putin within Russia, but also removed the largest and most pro-Russian voting bloc from Ukrainian politics. The landslide victory of Volodymyr Zelensky in presidential elections in April suggests that the polarization between eastern and western Ukraine that served Russia well is far less important today. To top it off, Moscow's actions in Ukraine have reinvigorated NATO despite all the centrifugal forces at work in Europe, and led to economic sanctions that have further slowed economic growth in Russia. To be sure, we should recognize Putin's deftness in Syria. The Kremlin has kept its ally Bashar al-Assad in power and retained its naval base with a small number of troops and few casualties. In the Middle East, the Kremlin has good relations with both Israel and the Palestinians, and with Saudi Arabia and Iran. Moscow's ties with longtime NATO member Turkey have never been better, while relations with China have improved. Putin may even manage to prop up the Maduro regime in Venezuela for a while. This is an impressive record. But in other areas, Putin's assertive policies have produced short-term victories that limit Russian power in the long run. This trade-off is not lost on the Russian public, which has tired of the Kremlin's foreign adventures. Surveys show that Russians prioritize economic development over foreign policy by large margins. Putin can continue to play his weak hand well and abet Russia's long-term decline, or try to strengthen his hand with all the inherent political risks of altering the status quo at home. My money is on the former. But before we crown him as a foreign policy genius, let's remember that his weak hand is largely of his own making. More importantly, by recognizing the self-limiting dynamics of Putin's foreign policy, we can keep the challenge from Moscow in proper perspective. Again, this entire article is worth reading, and others like it, but the point it's making is that, yes, Putin has scored all these victories, but there are aspects of it, it cites the situation in Ukraine, for example, where although he's gained this short-term victory, in the long term, it's not going to make him stronger, right? It's undermining his power, right? It's a short-term victory, but for a long-term loss. And Russia is ultimately not made the stronger by it. The last article I will read, it's from Foreign Policy. Another publication, and it says it's called Putin Lost His African Great Game. Putin lost his African great game before he started. And it makes a point that the first Russia-Africa summit, it's a significant achievement, right? It is a significant achievement, and it's something that projects power on the international stage. But again, as they analyze the scratch below the surface, it does not leave Russia looking as strong as it looks at an initial glance. So I'll read portions of this. It says, Russia is trying to fuel the perception that it's a major player. Grant Harris, who served as former US President Barack Obama's senior advisor for African affairs, told Foreign Policy. In Sochi is where the Russia-Africa summit was held. In Sochi, Putin was undoubtedly able to do so, but the data tells a different story. Since 2014, when sanctions following the annexation of Crimea forced Putin to find new markets and partners beyond the West's regulatory reach, Russia has made a concerted effort to expand into Africa. It hasn't had much effect. Today, only 3.7% of Russian goods end up in Africa, with more than 2.7% getting gobbled up by North Africa. A paltry fraction is destined for the bulk of the continent. It's even worse in reverse, as African goods account for just 1.1% of Russian imports. The Sochi summit was supposed to change all this. However, there's not much to suggest that it will. Of the 125 billion in deals that were allegedly signed, most were only memorandums of understanding that may never get off the ground. The problem is simple and seemingly unavoidable. Other than arms, of which Russia continues to be the continent's key supplier, there is little it has to offer and less that Africa will take. For now, it's hard to see how Putin's plan to find new partners, make more money, and restart the Russian economy will succeed. Right, and it goes on, right? That although the optics of it looks like a power play, right? The first Russia-Africa summit, 52 countries hosted, billions signed in memoranda of understanding, billions signed in apparent trade deals. That, you know, as you really scrutinize the picture, it's really not as overwhelming a victory as it initially looks. Right. So I just read these two articles to bring out this aspect that we see not in this line of the Syrian wars, but that is brought up by the Pyrrhic wars, which is these are victories. They're victories for the king of the south in 2019, but they're ultimately Pyrrhic victories, because we know that at Panium, which in the line of the Pyrrhic wars is Beneventum, that here the king of the south is defeated. Right? The Battle of Panium is of the same nature as the Battle of Raphia. It's a conflict over spheres of influence, right? And this apparent momentum of the king of the south, its momentum, this apparent momentum is stopped here at Panium, which in our line is 2021. Okay. I think obviously more can be said, but the principal point, which I think has been made, is that since 2016, we've identified the Battle of Raphia, and we understand Raphia as taking place in 2019 in our line, right? And we look to the natural to instruct us about the spiritual. We look to the little history to tell us what the fulfillment looks like in our time. And as we identify the characteristics, the principal characteristic being a conflict over spheres of influence, as we see the conflict play out between Russia and the United States, we see that the Battle of Raphia has been fulfilled and the King of the South has won that conflict, right? So again, as far as the integrity of this message is concerned, we do see the fulfillment of that which we have been teaching. Another thing is to identify the fulfillment of prophecy, it takes digging. Right? I hope you see that it takes digging to understand, one, the type or the natural, and when you're coming to the spiritual, you have to come to with the knowledge of what you're looking for based on the type, and it's doing that digging, connecting the prophecy to the fulfillment, right? Keeping an eye on the daily news cycle, doing your research on current events to see whether these things actually happened. It takes digging. It's not something that you just wake up one day and you just see, or that everyone will just wake up one day and just see, right? It takes, which is why those who've separated from us, right? They can say they made all these predictions, and none of them were fulfilled. Right? They'll write them down. Was this fulfilled? No, rub it out. Was this fulfilled? No, rub it out. Right? Some of you know what I'm talking about. But we are looking and we're seeing, right? We're seeing that these things actually did come to pass. And it's about how you approach it. It's about one, willingness to see it, I think in that case. But two, doing the work required, doing the digging that you need to be able to identify the fulfillments when you see them. I think I'll stop there. Let's close the word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word. We thank you, Lord, for the demonstration of the integrity of the message that we bear. Lord, we thank you that prophecies that we've spoken about in advance, some for years, that we can now look and see that, Lord, they surely came to pass. And Lord, we ask that this testimony may give us confidence in you as our leader, and in this movement that you're leading, and in this message that you're opening up to us. We thank you, Lord, that you meet our minds with understanding. You meet our minds with knowledge. And it is this knowledge that transforms. And Lord, we ask that you may help each one of us to do our part in receiving this knowledge, in understanding this truth, and in ultimately receiving the preparation that we need to do the work that we need to do in this dispensation and in the dispensations to come. We're in the Sabbath hours. Please bless us. bless our fellowship one together, one with another, over the course of these sacred hours. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.